Okay, so we're continuing. We'll have another break, short break at 5 o'clock. Our next speaker is Dr. Yakir Paz. Yakir is a faculty member in the departments of classics and Talmud at the Hebrew University. He's asked me not to say much more than that, which is probably a good idea because if I begin, it might take up the whole time of the lecture. Let me just say that he is a polymath and a polyglot with the most astonishing command of the sources in antiquity and late antiquity, stretching over certainly many centuries and possibly millennia. Yakir, please. Yakir is going to be speaking today about sourcing the Egyptian sorcerers, translating Janus and Jambres into rabbinic literature.
Thank you very much, David. And so there's a handout going on. I'm sure Shaul Shakir would have been very happy that there's actually a physical handout. I'll also put it on the screen for the people at home. So first thing, I'm very honored to be here, and I thank Professor Guy Strumza for inviting me. And I had the opportunity to learn from Professor Shakir, both in the fields of Middle Persian and Jewish magic. And I'll open just with a very short anecdote, which I think kind of encapsulates his personal or scholarly character. About, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, me and Avigail, who you just heard, and Rivka Elitzurnaim, we organized a small seminar on incantation bonds, which later would become the annual workshop for ancient magic. But at the time, we had only like 3 speakers. It was in a little room in the Mandel building. And as we were graduate students, none of us even thought of inviting Shaul to this thing. There were only 15 people sitting there. And as the actual talk started, Shaul, without being invited, he walked into this little seminar room and sat in the corner and listened to the whole event. And that, I think, was a very inspiring moment. So I want to start. So in Exodus, in the book of Exodus, in chapter 7 and 8, we encounter a magical duel between Moses and Aaron and the Khartoumim, the Egyptian magician priests. The Egyptian magicians try to prove that they too can perform the similar miraculous deeds as Moses, yet Moses and Aaron, supported by God, eventually defeat them. And they themselves acknowledge it. You can just see one of the examples on the handout. You have a few more. We are not told of the names of these Egyptian magicians. Yes, later traditions, beginning in the Second Temple, late Second Temple period, identify them as Yochana or Yochane and Mamre in Hebrew or in Aramaic, or as Yanis and Jambres in Greek. These magicians, both in the Hebrew and Greek names, appear later also in rabbinic literature. In this talk, I would like to trace the origin of the various rabbinic accounts on Yanis and Jambres, and most scholars have assumed that the rabbis had some access to ancient material regarding these brothers or to some unbroken tradition. In contradistinction, based on the narrative context and orthography of the names, I wish to argue that the traditions concerning Yanis and Jambres entered rabbinic literature at least three separate times, through 3 independent channels, through a direct translation of Syriac material, an accommodation of Greek narrative, and a Babylonian Aramaic magical tradition. So let us begin with our earliest text. I'll just talk about it briefly, the Damascus document from Qumran. So it's about 1st or 2nd century BC. We have, in the account here, we have a certain description of the enemies of the writer of the text, and he talks about the people who defile the Holy Spirit, blasphemous tongues have opened their mouth against the statutes of God, and they speak abomination, and whoever comes close to them will not be unpunished. And he goes on to say, for already in ancient times, God visited their deeds, and his wrath flared up against their actions, for it is not an intelligent people. They are folk bereft of advice, in that there is no intelligence in them. And then he says, for in ancient times arose Moses and Aaron by the hand of the Prince of Light, and Belial, with his cunning, raised up Yochana and his brother during the first deliverance of Israel. So I'm not going to go into the background of where the story, the possible origins, but it is important to notice a few things. First thing, we have here 2 brothers, Moses and Aaron, and against them 2 brothers. So, and in this case, we also have the like what happens above. We have Belial, so the prince of evil, and the prince of light. So Moshe and Aaron represent the prince of light, and Yochanan and his brother represent Belial. Interesting to notice that the name of the brother is not mentioned, and it could be because it's not yet known. I would argue that it's actually well known. What is most important for our point is that this is what the author is comparing to, meaning he's taking his present situation, and he says, just as previously they were punished, so too now the people who do this will be punished. Meaning, when you go from the unknown, the present, to the known, which means that when he's telling the story, he is not inventing the story. This is a well-known story, at least the characters are well-known, which will make makes comparison all the more viable. So the Damascus document already knows of a story about Yochanan and possibly Mamre of the 2 brothers. It is not invented here, which means we can take the story at least to the 2nd century BC. The next important text, which we can see and which had a lot of impact, is the second epistle of Timothy from the New Testament, where we read in chapter 3, "Now, as Yanis and Yambres resisted Moses, so also do these resist the truth, men with corrupt minds, reprobate in matters of faith. But they will not get very far, because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone." Here we have the 2 names, now in a Greek rendition, and I won't go into the way it actually transitions from Yochanan and Mamre to Yanis and Yambres, but this becomes more or less a standard transcription of the name. It is interesting to notice here they are mentioned, the 2 names are mentioned, but the basis of, possibly the basis of creation of the 2 names was the 2 brothers against the 2 brothers. Here we actually only have Yanis and Yambres facing only Moses, so not Aaron, and this will actually continue most of the tradition, meaning the basis of this kind of parallelism has been lost. But another interesting thing is that the author of Timothy, of the epistle, uses it in a very similar way as it's used in the Damascus document, meaning just as they, Yanis and Yambres, could not resist Moses, so too the people today will not be able. So in a very similar construct as it is used in the Damascus document. And it is important that in both cases we don't have no more narrative about these characters. I mean, they are the names of the Egyptian magicians, but not much more than that. So Yanis, and to a lesser degree, Yambres became very known. They even, on the handout, I won't show it here, you can also see in Pliny the Elder and Apuleius, they know of the name Yanis as a great magician. So he's actually, we can see here's the more senior part. The most elaborate account is found in a text known as the Apocryphon of Yanis and Yambres, or sometimes as the Penitence of Yanis. It's a text which was originally composed in Greek, and it was probably composed in Egypt, most likely before the 2nd century CE. It's already mentioned by several authors in antiquity, and in the last decades it's been compiled again through different fragments, papyri fragments, Latin translation, and other texts. But recently, several pages in Ethiopian have been found, which enable us to suddenly reconstruct not just fragments, but the whole story. There's a debate if this was originally a Jewish text or Christian, or was it a Jewish text which was elaborated later by Christians. But although this is a very rich text with a lot of narrative, I'm bringing it here only to say that it is completely irrelevant to our current inquiry, as I think it has no impact on the rabbinic tradition. And this, I think, this is clear from if we compare the account of the only scene mentioned in the Damascus document and Timothy, which is the encounter between Moses and Aaron and Yanis and Yambres, with that found in the Apocryphon. And you can see here, I'm reading from about the 8th line. So Yanis, this is talking about Yanis, and when he had completed his speech, he has been speaking to his brother and his mother, ambassadors were present from the king, saying, "Come quickly and oppose Moses the Hebrew, for he is making signs so that everyone is amazed." And Yanis, having come to the king, opposed Moses and his brother Aaron, doing as many things as they were doing, but when his death neared, tormented by a bad sore in his bottom, and not finding a bottom remedy, he sent word to the king saying, this is God's miracle that is operating for them. Therefore, I, wishing to oppose the power of God, depart to death. And then, actually, it's a long narration of his death, and afterwards he's brought back to make his penitence. So what is important to see that the only scene we actually know from previous texts has Yanis and Yambris always together in all rabbinic texts, in all the different variations. They are always together. And in this text, it's only Yanis, and actually the founding scene of this whole narrative is a very little, is very small moment in this text. It's pivotal, but it takes very little place in this text, which kind of shows that this is a completely different strand of the tradition, which has Yanis as the main character and Yambris as a secondary, whereas in all rabbinic texts there's no differentiation, never between the two characters. So this is a completely different trajectory from the one found in the Damascus document and in Timothy. So we can now turn to, before we actually turn to the rabbinic text, I just want to show, you can also see on your handout certain on the handout you can see the different variations of the names found in Hebrew and in Greek, which can still be added to it. But I just want to show the reconstruction of Siam Bayo, who did a very good job in suggesting a kind of possible way of the way it was transitioning to rabbinic text, where we have Yochanan and Mamre, then it influenced Timothy, and then he argues from Timothy it goes to two separate accounts, the transcription of Yanis and Yambris, and then Yoannis and Yoambris in Havdalah de Rabbi Akiva, whereas another trajectory impacts the Babylonian Talmud. So we'll be looking at this text, and in general I agree that these are three different instances, but I will now try to show where exactly they come from and also try and date it in a more exact way. So let's turn to the Babylonian Talmud. So the text is found in Bavli Menachot. And here we find the following account, quite brief. Yochanan Mamre said to Moses, are you bringing hay to Apharaim? He said to them, people say, take vegetables to a place of vegetables. Now this account seems a bit enigmatic, but the idea is that Moses is performing magic, and Egypt is the place of magic. So are you bringing hay or are you bringing hay or straw to Apharaim, which is known to be a place full of straw? And Moses says, yes, this is where you bring vegetables to the place of vegetables. So this is an interesting account. What is important to see here is, on the one hand, we have the name Mamre, which will be more or less the first, possibly the first account of the name Mamre in Hebrew. Again, I believe it was already known quite clearly in Hebrew in the Damascus document, but the just textual evidence we don't have an earlier attestation of the name Mamre, except in the magic bowls, which we'll discuss in a minute. And another interesting thing is that we don't know what the relationship between Yochanan and Mamre are. They're brothers, and they face only Moses, and not Moses and Aaron. And again, the idea I think the invention of Yochanan and Mamre as two was originally in order to oppose two magicians, and now we can see that this is taking a different strand. Now the question we have to ask is very clearly that this is the same tradition coming from at least from the names from something Hebrew or Aramaic, but we have to ask, does it come with any narrative embedded? Do they know more than just the names, that these are the magicians? Does it come from a certain narrative strain? And I would argue that it doesn't. You can see a text in Genesis Rabbah which has a very similar account, but I'll skip that and just discuss the text from the Tanhuma, which is Palestinian, where we can see the following account. They said to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh. When they went to Pharaoh, he said to them, perform a miracle. Thereafter Aaron threw his staff. At that moment, Pharaoh mocked them. He said to them, Moses and Aaron, do you suppose that you have come to mock me? Yet I am not afraid of such thing. The whole of Egypt is full of sorcery. Does one lead straw or hay to Apharaim, gold to Rechem? So we see this account just with Pharaoh, with exactly the same narrative discussion, the same formula of hay to Apharaim. We don't have here the response of Moses, which might be a rabbinic addition from a well-known phrase in Babylonia. But the narrative structure already exists in Palestine, already in Genesis Rabbah in a different form, later in the Tanchuma, without the names of Yochanan and Mamre, which would indicate that when the editor of the text in the Babylonian Talmud adds the name, he's adding them to a pre-existent story, which means he doesn't have an independent narrative about Yochanan and Mamre. He knows that they are names of the magician, but that's more or less what he knows. Another thing which is important, that the fact that he doesn't have to explain it means that it's most probably known to the readers, to the audience, that Yochanan and Mamre are the name of these magicians. So where does it come from? So already in the text published by Shaked and Ford and Pyro, and also in another text which Ford hasn't yet published, we have Yochanan and Mamre appear in the incantation bowls in a magical context, exactly where they're supposed to appear. And we can see, reading from line 3, by this deed of divorce that came from the great Alexandria of Egypt, the certificate that went forth by the hand of Yochanan and Mamre, we can complete Yochanan and Mamre because we have it in a parallel text, so it's not doubted. By these names of the angels that were written in documents. So we have here Yochanan and Mamre, the two names, appearing within a magical context because they are magicians, and they appear in Alexandria, in Egypt. And they most probably appeared several times, functioning in a certain way in the text. And I would argue that most likely that the magical tradition preserved these names. We have other examples. I've written about the fallen angels, where we can see that the magical texts preserve the relevant aspects concerning magic about the fallen angels. And it's quite possible that the magical tradition preserved the names of two sorcerers, which was important, this is the way it was known eventually, I think, also to the rabbinic audience, and eventually just superimposed, just the two names are put into a Palestinian narrative. So I think the fact that the story in the Babli Menachot knows nothing besides the names and knows the magician, and the fact that they kind of appear several times in the incantation bowl would show that the movement is actually, the rabbis have no tradition about Yochanan and Mamre. In Palestine, they don't know these names anymore. Only when a Palestinian story moves to Babylonia, he can then use a name which is known in Babylonia, but most probably through the magical text. And now I want to turn to another text called Havdalah de Rabbi Akiva, which is a kind of booklet, magical booklet, which has different recipes, most probably edited in the Gaonic period, but as shown by different scholars, the sources of some of the recipes go back to the Sasanian period. And in it we find this following formulation. Just as the deed, Ioannis and Ioamris did not rise against Moses in Egypt, thus all the people, the sorcerers and the whisperers of charms and the diviners of those who devise evil plan, shall not stand before us. So we should notice several things in this text. First thing, we can see that the word ma'aseh, deed, is just, when it says the deed of Ioannis and Ioamris, the word is an addition, because the text really reads very clearly, Keshem shelo kamu Ioannis v'Ioamris, just as Ioannis v'Ioamris did not rise. So the word ma'aseh seems to be an addition of a copyist in a certain stage, which we can discuss why it's been added. The second thing is the way the names are written, Ioannis and Ioamris, and as I said, Siam Hairo has already noticed this as a separate tradition. And then what do we know about what narrative details we have? We have that they did not rise against Moses in Egypt, and we see the same structure which we have seen already in Timothy and in the Damascus document of this kind of they are a certain historiola, a certain precedent to what you want to happen now. So just as they could not resist Moses, so too the client won't be harmed by any of the magicians. So it shows that previous magicians failed, so too current magicians will fail. So where does this come from? Sholem has already noticed that this is obviously the Greek transcription of the name, so it obviously doesn't come from a rabbinic source, but some kind of Christian source. But I believe that in this case we can actually pinpoint exactly, or more or less exactly, where it comes from. If we look at the Pshita translation, the Syriac translation of 2 Timothy, we can see, and I put here also in Hebrew letters so it makes it a bit clearer. So just as Yanis and Yambris rose against Moses, so Kamu, the same Kam, so exactly against Moses, Kam Lukubal Moshe, so stood against Moses, so also they rise against the truth, men whose mind is corrupt. So it's the same structure. We do have to say it's slightly different because it's the word, the root Kam is used slightly different in the Havdalah, meaning just as they did not rise against, meaning they did not succeed, but the verb is exactly the same verb, so it's just a change from positive to negative. The one thing that we can see is different is, though, in the Syriac, in the Pshita, it's Yanis and Yambris, not Yoanis and Yoambris. And yet, if we look to various versions of the Pshita, we can find a certain version preserved by Dionysius Bar Tzalibis, it's 12th century, but he's preserving a certain different transcription. We can see it here in the thing, where it's just as Yoanis, so the same transcription, Yanis and Yambris, stood against Moses. So it's almost direct correspondence of both the verbal and the way the names are written. So in this case, I would argue it most probably that the author of Havdalah most probably didn't take it directly from the New Testament. Most probably Syriac magicians might have already used this text in a certain way, and it is then more or less translated and transliterated. The names preserve exactly the same way it is written in Syriac. So in this case, we can talk about a context most probably in Babylonia, earlier than the 9th century, most probably could be also be the same period, of a direct contact, a direct borrowing from a Syriac source. And it's interesting because the author of Havdalah could have used Yochanan and Mamre, which already appear in the Babylonian Talmud, but he seems to not be aware completely of that tradition. So turning now to a third case, which has not been discussed enough. So I think the earliest, in a lot of medieval texts, we find Yanis and Yambris. We'll talk about, if I have time, I'll also talk about the translation of Pseudo Jonathan. But the earliest, I think, evidence of Yanis and Yambris in this pronunciation is found in a piyut, a Palestinian piyut, a kedushta from the 7th day of Passover by Yosef Rabbi Natan, who's from the 7th century. And the text has been slightly corrupt. You can see it here. It says, at the beginning, it doesn't mean anything when we read it. Zadu yevanim vayimkarem bekisamemo, zadim adim bechosrenu, teomot yechasiumu. We can already see a correction on the side, I think by the same hand, which Yimkerem already connects it to Yambris, and we can very easily see how the Samech and the Mem are the same. And indeed, already in Ma'agarim, of the Hebrew Academy of Language, they have already corrected it. So it's quite clearly, the translation would be, Yonis or Yavnis ve'Yambris dealt haughtily with their sorcery, evil ones deluding with their trickery. And the whole poem here deals with the crossing of the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf, and then we have, from the Song on the Sea, we have the deep waters have covered them. So we can, first thing we can see that we have, we can see that the names Yanis and Yambris entered in a Palestinian context. I don't think, it's not necessarily that Yosef Rabbi Natan is the poem, but before the 7th century, in Palestine, in the Greek transliteration of the names, so not Yochanan and Mamre, but Yanis and Yambri already present. But now let's look at the narrative context. And if we see that here it's a very different narrative context. Yanis and Yambris are performing magic at the crossing of the sea, and they are then going to be covered by the deep water. And indeed, we have a later from a text, early medieval text of Midrash Vayosha, we have a similar account. He says, you blew with your breath and sea covered them. Our rabbi said that at the time when the Egyptians were drowning, there were among them 2 sorcerers whose name were Yochani and Mamre. Here we actually have the Hebrew names. And they said to Pharaoh, if this is a miracle performed by the Holy One, we can oppose it. Yet if it is performed by the angels, we can shake the angels into the sea. They performed sorcery and brought the angels down into the sea. The angel called up, "Save us, O God, for water has come up to our neck. And you, God, with your word drowned them in mighty water. It therefore says you blew with your breath and sea covered them. They sank like lead in mighty water." So we have this very interesting account of Yanis and Yambris, or Yochanan and Mamre, at the crossing of the sea. So another magic duel which happened on, just like we had in Egypt. So we could say again that maybe, just like I said about the Babylonian Talmud, that maybe they just knew names and they added it to a certain account about magic on the Red Sea. But I think in this case, I would suggest it's not certain that actually in this case it's possible that the names came with a certain narrative detail already from the Greek tradition. And I would just want to turn to a papyrus in Sahidic, in Coptic, which has been published relatively recently by Kruger, which he has Yanis and Yambris, and the relationship between this fragment to the actual Apocryphon of Yanis and Yambris is not very clear. The Coptic text itself is from the 4th century, and so it's a translation of Greek, so it goes back. And if we just look at this text, it's very fragmented, and I'm reading from the 3rd line. They counted the myriads of the Jews, most probably. They said, "There are 100 times 10,000 under the leadership of this little boy. He is going to shut the desert against us, and those who are his own he has taken away from those who are not his own." When Pharaoh heard these things, he forthwith wrote a furious letter saying, "Go to Memphis, bring ye Yanis and Yambris, the 2 sons, the priests of Heliopolis." And on that day did Yanis and Yambris come to Pharaoh. Now Kruger, who edited this text, put too much emphasis, I think, on the word little boy, and he thought this happens in some kind in the childhood of Moses, which made things a bit difficult to explain. I would argue that this is just a way of them, a pejorative way of addressing Moses, who grew up as a little boy, but doesn't mean that Moses is a little boy at that moment. But what we're actually dealing here is with the Exodus. And the interesting thing, which can show that it's clearly not from the tradition of the Apocryphon of Yanis and Yambris, the Yanis and Yambris are both still alive. As we saw, Yanis, the whole point of the story of the Apocryphon of Yanis and Yambris is that Yanis dies immediately after the confrontation from Moses, so he obviously cannot be active afterwards. So we have a completely different trajectory of Yanis and Yambris active during the Exodus. So we don't have the fragments, but I would argue that most probably, it's speculative, but I would say that when they go out, they would encounter then Moses at the sea. That will be the next magical stop where the Yanis and Yambris can actually perform something. And I would therefore think that this tradition entered rabbinic literature, the Yanis and Yambris, which we see in the Piyut, already with a certain idea that they were also confronting Moses at the sea. And we can also see the echo of a verse which hasn't been noticed before when he says, "They will close the desert. He is going to shut the desert against us." It's a kind of paraphrase in some way of what Pharaoh says in Exodus, and Pharaoh will say to the children of Israel, "They are entangled in the land, the wilderness has shut them in," which is just then kind of reversed onto Pharaoh. I would like now just briefly to discuss one more thing about the Yanis and Yambris in the Targum of Pseudo Jonathan. So in the Targum of Pseudo Jonathan, the Aramaic Targum of the Mikra, they appear 3 times. I've brought here 2 of them in the handout. So we can see that in one case, the Yanis and Yambris in Exodus 1, they interpret a dream. But here in Exodus 7, they say Pharaoh, I'm reading from the translation, from the Targum, and Pharaoh also called the wise man the magician, and they, Yanis and Yambris, the magician who were in Egypt, also did likewise the spells of their divination. More importantly, and which created a bit of scholarly chaos, is that in the Targum on Numbers, we have the translation of the 2 Ne'arim, the 2 which usually is translated as servants of Bil'am, translated as we can see, and he was riding upon his she-ass, and his 2 young men, Yanis and Yambris, with him. So in this case, we see that Bil'am is the father of the 2 of Yanis and Yambris. This is a very interesting detail. Since people thought that views that the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan preserves very earlier sources, they thought that the tradition of Balaam as a father of Yanis and Yambres is very ancient, and even Pietersma, who in his translation of the papyrus from the 3rd or 4th century CE in Greek, which has the genealogy of Yanis and very fragmentary, you can see he adds at the end of the second line, to the genealogy of Yanis and Yambres, Balaam, taking it from the Targum. This is obviously can't be. We can also see that all the other names are very Egyptian. Gavin McDowell has recently shown in an article, you have the reference, that very clearly that a few scenes in the Targum, not only Yanis and Yambres, all are based on the Chronicle, a book called the Chronicle of Moses, which is around from the 10th century. And we can see that the Targum is using it and not vice versa. And this is a very coherent account of Moses' fight with Cush and other things, which some of them come from Second Temple literature. But for our purposes, it's important that it takes a tradition. Bilam is a very important character in this narrative. And Bilam is already known from rabbinic text as a sorcerer who was present in the court of Pharaoh. I just want to point out two scenes just to show what happens here in this text. So let's say in chapter 11, it says, when Balaam, the enchanter, saw that the city was taken, he opened the gate and he rode the horse, he and his 2 sons, and they fled to Egypt. We can very clearly see here, and not only here, that Balaam is the main character, and the 2 sons are something which are stuck onto it. So we can see also with the verb, Vayirkav alasus, hu v'shnei banav vayanusu. Similar when we see, and then it says, and he also did not show mercy to the house of Jacob, following the advice of Balaam the enchanter and his 2 sons, for they were the advisors of the king in those days, and the king consulted with his 3 advisors. The 3 advisors then are actually Reuel, Job, and Bilam, like the rabbinic tradition. So it doesn't really fit. And in the final text, just to have a look, we can see at the end, when they kill, the end of the text, Moses fights against the Midianites, and it says, and Balaam the enchanter and his 2 sons they smote by sword. But immediately afterwards, and when Balaam the enchanter saw that Elazar son of Aaron the priest and Pinchas his son, the military commanders, chasing him, he performed sorcery and flew like an eagle. And then they kill him. So very clearly, originally there was just the account of Balaam being killed, just like we can see in all these cases. And Yanis and Yambres in this account do not perform anything individually. They are just adjuvants, they just are additions to Balaam. So I would argue that there was at a certain point after the original version of the Chronicle of Moses, there was a certain interpretation of, since he's a sorcerer and he has 2 boys which escort him, that these are Yanis and Yambres, and then they were added to all these places, which shows that this tradition definitely cannot be used to retroject it into earlier Greek sources. So to conclude, I just want to say that the rabbis had no continuous tradition concerning Yanis and Yambres. They were introduced at least 3 distinct times. In Babylonia, the Hebrew and Aramaic names of the sorcerers are found in an adaptation of a Palestinian tradition which did not know of the names. This most probably took place around the 5th or 6th century in Babylonia. This tradition was probably known to the editor and his audience from the magical tradition. The Greek versions of the names was reintroduced again in Babylonia, apparently without being aware of the Hebrew name. This was done through the mediation of a specific version of a Syriac translation to 2 Timothy. And this again took most probably place around 6th, 7th century. Another version of the Greek names was introduced in Palestine no later than the 7th century and likely directly from Greek. In this case, it's possible that the names arrived with some kind of narrative association to a magical duel which took place at the Sea of Reeds. And finally, I said that the fact that they are the sons of Balaam is a medieval addition to this narration. So it would seem that the rabbis had no continuous and unbroken tradition regarding Yanis and Yambres. The fact that he was adopted at least 3 times points once again to the interaction between the rabbis and the surrounding cultures, both in Palestine and Babylonia. Thank you.
Thank you, Yakir. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Even 10 minutes, yes. Okay.
That's the microphone.
The mic.
Thank you very much, Yakir. Very interesting. I have a question and a speculative suggestion for an answer, but before I give my answer, I'd be curious what your answer is, and I'd be curious what you think about my answer. I'm not sure what I think about it. In the very interesting piyut that you brought, this idea of, well, also in the Midrash Vayosha, this idea of sinking them in the sea. How does that develop? Where do you think that comes from? Do you have any idea?
Well, this is I didn't say work in progress, but it is a work in progress. We do have other accounts. We have readings, quite a few readings of prophetic verses of the crossing of the sea, which show that this was a very dramatic, much more dramatic. There were certain conflicts between angels, we have about God's horse against Pharaoh's horse, but Pharaoh's horse is actually the minister of the Egyptians. So the fact that the crossing of the sea was a scene of conflict, we just see it, and obviously the sea itself is a certain mythical entity. We have quite a few sources. So I do think this was a very... this was the place to have this kind of confrontation, and I believe this follows a certain trajectory. So in some way, it's also possible that these names were grafted. I'm not sure if I found, but I have to look deeper, if there was an early account just about magicians at the sea, possibly, and then we can go to more or less the same direction we went with Babylonian Talmud. I do think that the Coptic text does suggest, if they are indeed now, the Israelis have just left Egypt, and Yanis and Yambres are alerted to come quickly, they would most probably be used where magic is used, which would be at the sea. And in that case, one can say that Yanis and Yambres had some connection, a completely different trajectory from the Apocryphon of Yanis and Yambres, that they are still alive and that they are going to confront Moses at the sea. This is obviously somewhat speculative, because as usual with fragments, they are fragments. And so I would suggest this as a possibility without, I can't prove it beyond a shadow of doubt. So what was your suggestion?
It's not, I mean, it's very also, I mean, more speculative than your, I mean, I think it makes sense, the idea of the climactic kind of, this is the end of the story, and, you know, we want to finish them off at the very end. I was just struck by the Midrash Vayosha, the Tzalaluka Oferet B'mayim Adirim, the sinking like lead. Yeah. And it reminds me, I don't know if we have it attested in the eastern parts of the empire, but in the western parts we have these defictiones that are made on lead that sunk in the sea as a way of...
And, by the way, Moses' coffin, according to some of the traditions, was made of lead and put in the Nile. This is, so we do have connections of lead and certain things with Egyptian culture. So, and it obviously goes back also to Osiris and the accounts of drowning. So we could also have very easily an Egyptian account. You know, the idea of drowning in the sea or the Nile is very prevalent in Egyptian mythology. So this could also be somewhat of a broader account. And in general, Kruger in his article tries to actually add, there's not only this fragment, there's a couple of other fragments to bring in the Egyptian context, which is usually neglected. So I don't know, that could be, since I'm interested just in what, I'm not interested in what goes, I'm interested at this moment at the rabbinic literature, so I can't really argue what goes on behind the texts of such a text like this, but I do think that it makes sense that there was an account of Yanis and Yambres at the Reed Sea. That's my suggestion. Menachem.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. Your conclusions were very fast, so perhaps I entirely agree that one should distinguish between various layers and between Pseudo-Jonathan and others, and between Ioannis and Yambres and Yochanan and Mamre, etc. And all these are indicators for the layers and possible and Okay, so all this is very enlightening. But the question is, why discontinuity? Because in this piyut, for instance, it seems as if there is some story behind it, not very different from, perhaps, according to your interpretation, which seems to me very plausible, from the Coptic text. And in the Babylonian Talmud, it might well be, you cannot, it's not guaranteed, but why shouldn't it be part of some reminiscent remnant of? So that's my question. But perhaps I did. You said
no. This is a very good question. I would say first thing about the piyut is the fact, I mean, and you yourself, I think have written it, the fact that the name Yanis and Yambris are there, not Yochanan and Mamre, shows that it at least comes from a Greek tradition. Mm-hmm. Could the Greek tradition be a Jewish Greek tradition? Definitely. That's. Mm-hmm. But I'm saying within the rabbinic narrative, they did not know. And the fact, by the way, that we have the Tanchuma with more or less the exact same story as shows that the names Yochanan and Mamre were most probably not known to the author. So it seems that in Palestine we don't find evidence for these names in all the accounts about the magician. So it does make it seem likely. I don't think again that the piyut is the first to use it, but that this is more or less the time frame when it would have been reintroduced into the rabbinic or Hebrew tradition. Again, we have to separate between what I call rabbinic or let's say Hebrew and Aramaic tradition to Greek, which could be Jewish Greek. The other thing about the Babylonian Talmud is, first thing what's important is they don't seem to have a narrative context to it, but the two names, just like we find in medieval period, they just stick Yochanan and Mamre wherever there are magicians. This now is very easy to then find many traditions. So it seems to we have lots of tradition by Yochanan and Mamre, it's actually just sticking these names there. I would argue that since the story is, since it doesn't have a narrative, since the narrative template is a Palestinian narrative template, the fact that they add the names and don't have a rabbinic story, a Babylonian story, and the fact that they are so, the fact that the names are so naturally, I would say, part of the magical tradition and preserved in the magical bowls, would seem to be that this will be the most natural explanation of how these names were preserved if they're not preserved within a narrative context, if they're not preserved in a text, meaning a kind of Damascus document or something like that, then it just seems that the names were transmitted as magicians, just like pagan authors know of Yanis because it's well known. So I think the magic, they knew it from magical tradition. So I think magical tradition makes sense. It's also important to notice that the fact that it can't go back obviously to the Damascus document, because the Damascus document doesn't document the name Mamre. So we most probably had another text or Hebrew tradition, which we don't know of. But the important thing is that the fact that it lacks a narrative context would, I think, point to the fact that it most likely is preserved where these names have meaning in the magical tradition. But, I mean, you could say it's a shared tradition of Babylonian Jews. The magical practitioners use it, the rabbis also. But just the fact that the only occurrence is in a story which already pre-existed, and they add these names, seems to be that it's a certain moment where it happens. But, I mean, one can argue. At least, I think I've tried to show, more important for me, that it doesn't come with a narrative context. That's what's important. Just the fact that these are names of the magicians, that's all. That's at least more important for my argument.
We're going to have to stop. Thank you, Yakir.